So now that we've created our skeleton of the release pipeline, we want to populate those with tasks that will deploy the web application. The first step in this process, though, is we're going to create some variables groups. So we go over to variable group, add variable group. We're going to call this var dev, and we're going to add 3 variables to this. We're going to add the resource group name. We're going to add the slot name and the web app name. Resource group we'll call web app dev. The slot, we already have a production slot, so we've added one for development, and the web app needs to be unique within Azure itself. So I'll just use my initials, the date, my web app, and add dev on the end, and save. To save time, we're going to clone this variable set, and we'll call it var prod. And take the dev off here. We're going to call this pre-production or pre-prod, and take the dev off the end. Save. If we go back to the library, we can see we've created 2 var dev, var prod, and we can now go to our release. Here's our pipeline and the releases we have so far. If we edit that release and go to variables, first thing we're going to do is add ourselves a single variable for the pipeline release called region. So that's the Azure region we're going to deploy to. In this case, I'm in West US, and that's where we're going to deploy it. We go to the variable group. We can link a variable group, and we're going to link var dev to the stages rather than the release for test and development. So now we can return to the pipeline and add some tasks. If we click on the view stage tasks here, we'll add our first task, and we'll search for Azure resource group deployment and add. If we click the task itself, we can choose the subscription, which we've already set up with the service connections. The resource group, we want to use the variables, which was the $resource group name, and it is case sensitive, so make sure you get that right. We can add region in here and linked artifacts. In this case, we want to use the Azure deployment template. So if we go look just briefly at the GitHub project for the Quick Start Template 101 Web App Basic Windows, we can see we've got the Azure deploy JSON and the parameters file. If we look at the Azure deploy file, we can see we've got a web app name, so we need to be case sensitive of that. And the rest of these parameters we're going to pick up through the default parameters. So if we use the ellipsis, we can see our 2 source artifacts, and we have the hello world from our Azure repo and the GitHub Quick Start template. If we open this up and scroll down 101 Web App Basic Windows, expand that and choose the Azure deploy.json file. So that's the template we want to use. Now we want to do the same thing and pick out the parameters file. Scroll down. Parameters. In our case, we want to give a parameterized parameter for the web application name to this template. But instead of creating our own parameter file, we'll just override one particular parameter. So that's the parameter we want to override. So we're just going to do a dash parameter $web app name. And there are other deployment options there. We can choose the names and outputs and other things. We're not going to touch any of that at the moment. We're going to add our next job, which is an archive job. We're looking for the HTML docs root directory, so we don't need all the Azure Quick Start templates. That's really large. We just want to zip up the docs file there. We're also going to untick this prepend root. We don't want the root name on that. We just want to deploy it directly to it. and we can, if we have any trouble, we can use the verbose output. So let's tick that on. The next task we want to add is Azure PowerShell. You have a choice here of using a file path for a script, or we're going to use some inline code. I've already typed this out to save some time, but we'll review it. Pick your service connection. So the code here is new AZ web app slot dash resource group name, and we use the parameter dash name web app dash web slot web app, which is what the template does. So it actually adds dash web app to the name and uses the app service name for that plan. So we'll save that there, and we just need to come down. We've still got something wrong. It wants to know what version of PowerShell, so we're just going to use the latest version that's installed. We're going to add another task, which is the Azure App Service deploy. Again, pick the service connection. I'm going to copy these parameters in to save some time. So $web app name dash web app. We want to deploy to a slot, right? Paste in the resource group name here, and the slot name we want is again the parameter we've already created. Now in this case we can see what's next. We're looking for the package or folder. So that's what we're creating in this archive file. So if we look at this output here, to keep things simple, we're going to call this the web app name, and we're just going to copy that parameter as it is into our app service package deployment. So in our staging directory, these are one of these predefined variables that exist within Azure DevOps. And we have one last task here, is select deployment method. So it will try to auto detect. In our case, we just want to use the zip deploy. So we've gone and created the zip file, we've told it where to find that zip file, and we've told it how to deploy it. Fingers crossed, that should be the dev stage complete. So we'll save that. Next we want to go and create the tasks for test. In the task for test we're going to do a swap application slots. So under app service manage, if we add that, we're going to pick our Azure subscription again. We're going to pick the app service name. So that's our web app dash web app, resource group name, slot name, which in our case was dev, and we want to swap that with production. So for our test environment, we're moving the development stage into the test stage, which is the production version of this web application. And we'll click save. So to kick this off, we can commit some code again. So we'll call this my world HTML app, my code, save all and commit, and let's push that change. If we go look at our releases, we're going to see release 6. There's some ones I deleted in between that. And we'll watch the development. If we dive into the release itself, we can see that job's being initialized, artifacts being downloaded. We can also actually look at the pipeline again while we're waiting for that. Under the test task itself, if we scroll down here, we can see artifacts to download. So for that environment, we don't actually need to download all this content. So that's a very large file. So we're just going to untick these two and that should speed up our deployments. So we'll save that and just say remove artifacts. So that's not going to happen until next release, which is fine because that will still help us through this version. So we're still deploying, waiting for output. If we go over to our Azure subscription, so we're in the Azure portal, refresh that, we can see the web apps here, and currently we have no resources inside it, but we have one resource group template being deployed. And here's the deployment name, date, time, and we can dive in and start looking a little bit closer at all these resources. I'm going to pause the video at this point and return once this web application has deployed into this resource group. So let's have a look at our environment. We can see the web service template to finish deploying. If we go to the resource group, we can see our app service plan, we can see the dev slot here, we can see the application itself. So we've deployed into the dev slot. If we open up that slot there, and then we do browse, we can see the static sample HTML, which is the page we should be seeing. If we return to our deployment, we can see we're not scheduled to go into the test environment yet. It's waiting. If we go back to the web app and look at our production slot and browse, we'll get the default template here. If we return to this piece and choose to deploy manually, so rather than waiting for that scheduled time, we're just going to say manual kickoff, and we're going to deploy. That job is now queued. While we're waiting for that to complete, we'll come back and have a look at the logs for this task itself. And we can see the various initialized job, download artifacts. Here we created the resource group, gives you the times of how long everything's taken. You can see the inline PowerShell script we used to create the slot, and the application deployment and the job's been finalized. If we return to the release, we can see now this is the downloading artifacts. So because we changed that artifacts before this release, that change isn't in effect in this release v6. So we're going to have to wait for that to download. So you see how removing those artifacts that we don't use will speed up this deployment time. Here we can see we're up to the swap slots. It's running. So we've now got the -dev website, which is now empty because we've swapped the application into the new site, and running in our production slot for the dev environment is our sample application. So we've successfully created and executed our first pipeline task and moved a web application and deployed the infrastructure for it using parameters and a continuous deployment trigger. As a final task, you can change the code here and make sure you change the header. I've just executed the change on the wrong title, so we'll change the header this time and we'll commit that change. So we'll save that, welcome to DevOps, and we'll push that change there. So that's going to initiate a new release, and what we're going to see is into the dev slot we're going to see the welcome to DevOps header change, and our production or test version of the application will have the old version of the website. So we'll minimize this, and there's my previous release. I pushed it into the, didn't make the change in the right heading. I'll pause the video and we'll just wait and see how that goes. So that release is completed. If we go refresh the main website, we can see we've still got our HTML code there, and if we refresh that site, we can see in the development slot we now have welcome to DevOps.